for the introduction, and I am so happy to be with you today to talk a little bit about how we create an inclusive culture, or how we try to. As I like to call it, getting from boxes to circles, and I'll explain what that means in a moment. So first, I'm hoping that I learn how to use the computer, but here. There we go. Thank you. So first, a little introduction of myself, because I think that's important for us to know why it is that this topic matters to me. As was shared, I am an investment management attorney. A significant portion of my practice is spent with impact investors. That means people who invest in the markets looking for both financial return and a particular social impact. And a subset of those investors are actually people that are targeting investments with women-led and diverse-led organizations, businesses, venture funds, nonprofits, with the idea that that is a way to diversify the business community if you actually invest in those type of businesses and organizations. At the firm, I also advise the board as part of our diversity committee on diversity issues. And if you know anything about big law firms, Fakery is an international law firm with about 750 professionals, attorneys. There are a lot of diversity and inclusion challenges in law firms, so there's a lot to talk about when you're talking in a big law setting as to how to create an environment that's diverse and inclusive. And then, like you in the room that volunteer your time because you want to help the community, I spend a lot of time that I don't get paid for, like all of us, working with organizations, mostly nonprofits and corporate entities that are looking to build pipelines of Latinos. Alpha is the largest and longest standing Latino professional organization with about 90,000 members nationwide, over 7,000 here in Chicago, and about 50 years of history. And we have one vision and one mission. Our vision is more Latinos in leadership roles in professional environments, nonprofits and businesses. And our mission is to build a pipeline from the college classroom into those leadership roles. That's simple, incredibly complex. And then on a personal basis, if you did not notice, I am a Latina woman, and I am married to a non-Latino, and so I negotiate a diverse and inclusion atmosphere at home all the time as we negotiate over whether we're having turkey burgers again or arroz con pollo. So inclusion is incredibly important to me, both professionally and personally. So then, jumping from who I am, before jumping to what we're going to talk about, I want to talk about what we're not going to talk about. And the reason is diversity and inclusion is so complex and has so many distinct parts and issues that people handle that if you're not clear about what you're trying to achieve and what you're talking about, things get confusing fast and it leads to a little bit of shutdown. People don't even know where to start. So we are not talking about the case for diversity and inclusion. I am assuming everybody in the room or listening understands the moral and business imperative for diverse and inclusive cultures. Second, not talking about pipelining and recruiting. That is really hard. It's really hard to recruit diverse teams, to find the right people. I spend tons of time for my own firm and with Alpha doing that, not what we're talking about today. Third, not talking about equity initiatives. What I mean by those are initiatives, programs, ideas that workplaces put in place to ensure that people with diverse background and women have a level playing field. That might manifest as pay issues or other programs, but we're not talking about those today. We're literally just talking about how you shift the corporate or the nonprofit, the workplace mindset from being one of diversity to one of inclusion. And here is where I actually like to talk about what inclusion actually means to me, because when you work with your clients as consultants, you first need to understand what they think inclusion is and what it means for them. For me, it's very personal. I said I'm a Latina woman. I'm actually Puerto Rican. Born and raised in Puerto Rico, I came to the mainland for college. I grew up in a complete homogenous environment where I was part of the majority. I thought a minority were Episcopalians, and it was because their priests got married. Everybody in Puerto Rico was Puerto Rican. I never thought I was the other. I never thought I was different from people, and that's how I was raised. So when I got to the U.S., I went to St. Louis University. It's a great Jesuit school in St. Louis that is tight with Puerto Ricans because Catholics. And there's a big Puerto Rican community there. Really tries to be a diverse and inclusive community for everybody that they bring to the university. One of the first things that happens when you go to college is they put you in one of these spirit groups, right? Like the seniors, and bring in the newbies, help them understand what happens. And one of the first things they do is all the student clubs. They would sit you down, they'd explain all the clubs, and they're very clear that you should try everything, because you don't know who you are, you're 17 or 18, try everything, see what fits, what you like. Except for one. My spirit person said, you'll be part of the Latino Student Association. And my answer was, I don't know. And it was a true answer. I don't know, one, because you just explained to me that I should vet everybody to decide what I want, and I'm not sure if that's like the group I want to be part of. What if they're weird? But second, I didn't think of myself as Latina. I was Puerto Rican. This was pre, like the Latino music boom. So it's not like I even understood the concept of I'm in a new group that I'm being lumped in. Her response to my I don't know was, what do you mean you're Latino? This was somebody that was so nice, so welcoming. It was also the first week I was there, and you don't want to piss somebody that important off that quickly. So I said, oh, yeah, okay, sure, okay. Now, here's the thing. She was being so helpful. She was one of the nicest people, and yet I felt completely awkward. I did not feel offended. I did not think she was evil. I just felt awkward. But what was the outcome of that? I never joined the Latino Student Association. Later in college, I actually attended some events and kicked myself for the missed tacos and empanadas for all those years in college. Amazing free food. But I never joined. I don't know that if it was conscious or subconscious, but something about that interaction meant that I spent my college years staying with the Puerto Rican community, and then with, the other people that I met, which included my husband, who was non-Latino. And I always share that story because to me, it is where I start with people. You can be committed to diversity and inclusion. You can do everything in your power to make people feel welcome, and still also make them feel completely unseen and unheard. So that's why I always start there. You want to really understand what inclusion is, and whether you are working in still the diversity box perspective or the inclusion circle. I will explain what these are in a moment, but I like to talk about specifics, particularly because usually around diversity and inclusion, things become a little tricky and uncomfortable for people. So I will use myself as an example because I talked about myself. So this is my diversity box. So this is the box that usually shows up when I would apply for a job or for a loan. It's the protected classes under the law that people have to report, right? And so I would choose white, Hispanic, woman, non-veteran, not disabled, and heterosexual. And that's who people see that I am. This would be my inclusion circle. This is who I say I am. This is how I see myself, right? This is if somebody asked me, what do I think is what I bring to the table? It's this. And I'll point a couple of things, and we'll talk about the benefits and the problems with both, but I will point a couple of things really quickly. One is, if you look at my my inclusion circle, race is not there. Why? It's an incredibly complicated topic for me, or issue for me. One is, if you're Puerto Rican, you have no idea what your race is. Somewhere generations and generations ago, a lot of Spaniards mixed with slaves and Puerto Ricans appeared. And so I don't feel either white or black. I also do not feel biracial, because maybe somebody generations ago felt that they were the product of two races. I don't. I feel Puerto Rican. I have to choose a box in my diversity box, and I choose white because I do not feel like I'm in an underrepresented community from a race perspective. I don't feel black. I don't feel biracial. The thing is, nobody probably would say Emma's white. I don't look white. My kid doesn't look white. My last name doesn't look white. And when I drink, I speak Spanish. So white, probably not what people would normally say I am. But that's the box I am forced to choose. Another thing you won't notice is I list Hispanic. I list my first identity is Puerto Rican. And that has nothing to do with me not absolutely believing that it is important and imperative for Latino subgroups to work together as Latinos as opposed to by our particular countries. Because in the US, in our current environment, we need to work together as a larger group. I do tons, 85% of my diversity work is for Latinos. But I am Puerto Rican. That's how I identify. And we'll talk about why that makes a difference in a moment, in a very concrete way, but it does make a difference. But the other thing is, you won't see Hispanic, you'll see Latino, and people ask me all the time, well, like, what's the difference? I was like, that's the point. I don't know, and I'm supposed to be both. But here's the thing, Hispanic is what the government asks for a box, but J-Lo and Ricky Martin say they're Latino, so that's what I go with. In practice, I don't know what the difference is, but that says something. Now, there are people who will, instead of saying they're Latino, say they're Hispanic. And the other thing I would add is, if you see sort of on the work or professional sleeve, I view myself as an investments expert first, not a lawyer. But most people, when they look at me, they see a job and they say lawyer. Right? So those are sort of the big differences if you look about how I see myself and how I want people to see myself, as opposed to how we have to report. And that's the primary difference. A culture that focuses on diversity will focus on the reporting that needs to be done to the government, your donors if you're a nonprofit, your investors or shareholders if you're a for-profit. You have to report it, so you have to track it, and all of a sudden it matters. But we're not talking about reporting. We're talking about culture, and culture should not be led by the baseline of what is reportable. Culture should be led by the baseline of who are our people, and what do we want to build. And so the inclusion circle allows for that. But let's talk about what's sort of good and bad about going that route. So first, on the benefits, sort of on points messaging of the circle versus the box. First, it is literally inclusive. It allows everybody to have a circle. Whether or not you're a woman or an underrepresented community, you can have a circle. People will when I say that, people will tell me often, rich white men don't need a circle. They're already included because they're part of the majority. That's the point. We're trying to include people from other communities into the majority, so they're sort of already there. That is reporting. But when you're talking about culture, it's about sense of community and feeling. And everybody needs to be able to be part of that, part of the circle. So it literally allows everybody, because everybody has an identity. I don't care that you're a rich white man. There are things that got you there. You might talk about your background. You might talk about your experiences. You might be an Olympian. I don't know. I would like to know. And that's what the circle allows you and your workplace to find out about your people. Second, it talks about who we are and now how we're different. That's one of the challenges of a diversity box and the reporting mechanism when you think of diversity. That is talking about how we are different from the baseline, from the majority. So if we go back quickly, when my diversity comes up, box comes up, people will immediately say, she's a Latina woman. Because your brain is wired to disregard my majority flags, white, non-veteran, not disabled, heterosexual. You see it and your brain says, like everybody else. And the two things that stand out are Latina and woman, and that actually sort of depends on which community you are. Like there are some communities that there's a lot of women, so that wouldn't even stand out. So you'd just be like the Latina woman. If my box actually said white, not culturally or ethnically different, a male, non-veteran, non-disabled, LGBTQ, I would become the gay man. That is how your brain, how people will see it. That's the gay guy. She's the Latina woman. That is difficult when you're trying to create an inclusive culture, as opposed to a diversity box for reporting, which is important and you have to do to hold people accountable. But we're talking about culture. So the circle allows and will allow your clients to understand who their people are. And that makes a difference. Second,
can I interrupt a second? I don't know if you hear me.
Yes.
I'm participating online, and I'm just wondering if you can share, if there's a way to share, or if I'm not participating correctly in terms of looking at something that you're talking about that you're showing.
Oh, I apologize.
No, not visually, just auditorially.
Got it. So I'm being told that you would receive this afterwards. I apologize.
Okay. Thank you.
So the second is that the inclusion circle will assist with performance management. Here I like to use a very specific example. A company moved from sort of the diversity box to the inclusion circle and went through the effort of having employees fill it out and found something rather surprising. So for years, this is a company that manages nationwide those boats that take people out on the river and lakes, like tours, stuff like that. Everybody thinks those are mom and pop shops. They're like owned by 3 national companies. So one of those companies consistently had, found issues and complaints from the people that they hired to clean the boat or to service host to people coming in. They could never figure out what the complaints were. They just complained about stuff didn't work. One of the things they had noticed was that for filling out those positions, they hired, usually for the summer, college kids that were interested in boating, that liked boats. They had an interest, so hire them cheaply. They couldn't quite figure out why these complaints kept happening and why turnover was happening. Unrelated to that, they did the inclusion wheel exercise. And one of the things they found, and I should say, the other thing they had independently had issues with were their vacuum cleaners. Spend tons of money changing vacuum cleaners all the time, and they had thought it was that water kept getting on boats and the vacuum cleaners kept getting dirty, and so crazy amounts of money going to commercial vacuum cleaners. So they did the diversity wheel, and lo and behold, they realized that the other group of people that fits college kids that like boating are rich kids that never cleaned. Because those are the people who actually have been on boats, right? And it doesn't have to do about race. It literally has to do with people who have the economic ability to just take time and be in boats and learn sailing and all of that. Those were the people that they were hiring. They weren't trying to be racist. They weren't trying to do anything. It just sort of fit who they wanted. And those are also the sort of people that will never say, I don't know how to use a vacuum cleaner, because it looks really easy to just stand there and move it forward and backward. But commercial vacuum cleaners, actually, there's a science to how you use them. You have to change certain settings if you're going to different floors, if there's water on the floor. So these people would never say, I don't know how to do my job. And the company, because they were the majority, wasn't otherwise noticing that they all sort of were like rich kids that had never cleaned in their life. And so all of these things were connected. So the HR person that had done this exercise was, I think we have a solution, which is they need vacuum cleaner training. And they just tried it. And it was day and night. First, it turned out they had been throwing away perfectly fine commercial vacuum cleaners that worked, but just people didn't know how to use them. Second, they were actually training people appropriately. And third, no, they had happy people that actually, college kids that came back year after year because they enjoyed working there, were getting trained, enjoyed it. Wouldn't have happened if they actually hadn't taken a step back to be like, what is going on here, and let's just do this. So that's what I mean by skill gaps often are tied to things we don't really think about when we just focus on diversity boxes. Second, it improves team communications. Talking about diversity and inclusion is really hard when you feel like you are sort of the voice because you're the diverse person on the table, and everybody else sort of feels like they have to listen to the voice because he or she's the one with experience. It puts a lot of pressure on the person that is the one that's different. Sort of everybody else has majority flags. You're the one that's the Latina woman or the gay man, so you get to tell us how this works. That is difficult from a culture perspective. That might actually be perfectly fine from an equity initiative perspective, right? You might need to have programs in place that allow for people to have a true voice at the table. Those are equity initiatives. That is not about culture or creating a feeling of an inclusive culture. For team communications to really work, everybody has to feel like they have something to add. And they can do that if everybody has a circle, right? Everybody has an identity that they can talk about and that they can share with everybody else. But, it's not all rosy. The challenges. First, everybody always says, do you know how much information we would have to track about all of our people? Everybody thinks there's a special snowflake, right? They'd have like 20 million things, and nobody's telling you gotta track this, right? What we're talking is how do you create environments where people feel like they want to share? and they want to participate. And going through a wheel or a diverse inclusion wheel or circle exercise helps with that. Second, we'll talk about this in a moment. You also need to think about there are people who do want to track that information. It's their managers who already are supposed to really know who their employees are from a skills perspective. This is useful information for them. The company or the nonprofit as a whole doesn't have to sort of track who all their marathon runners are, but the direct managers of people it would be beneficial for them to have that information. So I always say data management, yes, if you think you have to track it for everybody, but you don't. Second, it can cause complacency with tackling diversity. What do I mean by that? People will, when they go through these, take a second. People who already have teams that are really not diverse from a racial or gender or sort of other of the traditional qualifiers don't have teams that are like that. Love the inclusion wheel because they can look at the inclusion wheel and say we have an incredibly diverse group of people with diverse backgrounds because they all have different engineering degrees. And so, they'll change the conversation about diversity to one of just different perspectives, different identities. That's why I said we are not talking about pipelining and recruiting because these are separate things. Your clients need to focus on creating diverse teams, pipelining people for long-term hires, recruiting them for immediate hires. They need to do that, and they need to build truly diverse teams. Once you have a team, you need to create an inclusive culture. I think a little bit what happens is people that don't have a diverse team really like talking about identities, and so it creates a problem long-term. So how do you get from one to the other? First, and I always say this, depending where your clients are, and you guys might be the solution, diversity and inclusion consultants. I am not a diversity and inclusion consultant. I just spend a lot of time doing this and have spent a lot of time doing this through my career. And so can tell people, here's what worked at this company, or here's somebody here that you should talk to because I know they just struggled with that same issue. That is very different than somebody that can actually assess your organization from the top to the bottom and tell you where your bottlenecks and your issues are from a pipelining or recruiting perspective, but can also tell you how your organization may or may not be receptive to a switch into an inclusion circle and how to get there. So I start with really get an expert. Second, there should be a second there, but this one's actually third. Second is figure out what your circle is. In my head, I always just assume people already know, but I put into the deck in the back just a few examples of the circles that if you literally Google inclusion wheel or diversity circle, there are a gazillion different types that different companies have used. And they get really complex and they're very simple. I prefer the simple ones because this is about culture and about communication, not about data management. The more complex you get, the difficult it is to just process who your people are. Keep it simple, but keep it open for people to create that environment. So first, find your own circle or the circle that works for your client. Then actually do the circles. This is oddly the part where it stops. I have been with many organizations sort of helping them on D&I where they decide we're doing this, here's our circle, it looks amazing. They do a presentation to all employees. Here's how we think about diversity and inclusion. We see all of you. All of you are different. We want to respect each of your identities. And then they never talk about it again. So people know that the company respects each of their identities, but the company doesn't know who each of their identities are. It's sort of like they tell them, but then they never ask. They're not seen and they're not heard. So literally do the circles. There's different ways that people do them. I actually have seen that one that seems to work pretty well and might work for your clients. If you start with the senior leadership team doing it themselves first, that particular group of people, assuming it's an organization that doesn't have other separate issues to tackle, usually the executive team is used to dealing with more complex and difficult topics, and so they've developed their own little subculture in how they communicate. And so can be more receptive to doing true inclusion circles together. Because one thing I didn't mention is, the first inclusion circle that somebody does usually is sort of very, the baseline. You will never, or I should say never, hardly ever gonna get somebody in their first inclusion circle saying I'm a rape victim. But you will get, I support women initiatives, right? And I am an advocate for children who have suffered child abuse. You will get things like that. And then your organization knows that that employee, that's something that really matters and it's an identity for them. You support them on that, and over time, you will one day find out, I'm a rape victim, right? Or I was a child abuse victim. So I share that because it does require trust that develops over time, but your senior team often already has a trust relationship. So it's nice to sort of start with them, get their buy-in, do it, they see how helpful it is, and then they help roll it out for the organization as a whole. And I actually do mean they participate in the second rollout. You don't want the senior team to not do it again with everybody else. It sends the wrong exclusionary message as opposed to inclusion. Plus, they also serve as an example of, I did it, here's why it worked, let me share with you mine, let's do yours. The next one is, and I should say also, cross teams. I've seen companies do cross teams, right? The accountants doing with this people, that people for big organizations, or also just on a team by team basis, the 3 people who always work together. It just sort of depends on the particular company and the culture they already have. The thing is, don't forget new employees. People will also do this. They will roll this out, the whole company does it, and then new employees come in and they never do it. And so everybody's talking about their circles, and the new employees like, what's this whole thing? Again, sends an exclusionary message. So you want to send this message that we are an inclusionary culture, that we do this right. So everybody who walks through the door, let's build your circle. You should probably do it with a manager. I mean, you could do it with HR, but you really sort of want to do it with the person that will be responsible for that employee. Then update the circles. We talked about this a little bit. They're not static. They should be updated. I always recommend the annual performance review. That's the place where people already are used to having to talk about themselves, and it gets awkward and uncomfortable already. So like add this in. Second, circles change significantly over time. When I first graduated law school, my primary identity probably was lawyer because I had just killed myself for 3 years. So I was going to tell everybody that I was a lawyer. But I hardly ever talk about being a lawyer anymore, even though that is where I spend probably 90% of my day is helping my clients on legal issues. Hardly ever talk about being a lawyer. So you want to update those circles. And then celebrate the circles. So the difference that I always say is, for those of us of diverse backgrounds in workplaces or other communities where we are one or the only one or one of a very few, we are used to being in every promotional picture that is put on a website or in any activity for that organization, because people love celebrating that they have diverse teams. They will, like, if their numbers are good, they are blasting those, right, from every billboard. It's really hard to do that with an inclusion circle, right? Like, what, are you going to tell people that you have a bunch of people that like are foodies? Like, nobody will care out in the community. But you can celebrate them internally, because this is about your internal culture. It's about your people, knowing who they are and getting them seen. There are people, I should also say, do not share all employee circles without getting their permission. That will be a violation of trust. But celebrate the ones that do want to share, right? And you can send an email once a month with somebody's circle. Like, the spotlight this week is Maria, and here's Maria's circle, and she's talked a little bit about what she does. The sort of things that make people feel like they are part of the organization. So at the end of the day, and I think I've been over for a couple of minutes, what we always say is you want to get away from seeing people how whoever you have to report them wants to see them, right? That should not drive your culture. You want to see your people for what they want to be seen, and that is the move to the circle. So I don't know if we have time for Q&A. We're done with our time, but I did include there, like I said, a couple of the different inclusion circles. If you Google them, there's a million more. I included also my contact information. Feel free to reach out if you or your clients have questions or issues around this, particularly around the Latino community, or if anybody is interested in impact investing. Thank you so much for having me.